Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Vokes. I now ask Dina Batchelor and Bodhi Elizzi from Aspley State High School to deliver the student presentation in honour of Lieutenant Harold Francis Frank McCosker, BEM.
Historians have said for generations that Australia's experiences in World War I were a baptism of fire. If that is true, then the events of World War II and the battle for Australia were then a coming of age, with the recognition not only for the role our country held in the Pacific, but the dangers and responsibilities it involved. To an entire generation, the events of 1941 to 1945 were a realisation that not only did Australia need to look to its own defence and safety, but this became a challenge that those Australians could well and truly meet. Few Australians understood and made this commitment more than Lieutenant Harold Frank McCosker, who was to play a major role in one of the first conflicts of the war in the Pacific, the Battle of Milne Bay. When war broke out in 1939, Frank McCosker was one of the thousands of Queenslanders who signed up to defend king, country and empire. But as the events of the Pacific War unfolded, it became clear that rather than follow the path of his Anzac forefathers to Europe and the Middle East, it would be Australia herself that would need protecting from the onslaught of relentless Japanese juggernauts. Frank McCosker, joining the newly formed militia, would take him from the peaceful farmlands of the Glasshouse Mountains to the potential new front lines of Brisbane, then Townsville, and finally to one of the most decisive and frightening conflicts of the Pacific War, in the uncharted wilderness of New Guinea. As the Japanese moved through the Pacific with a speed and ruthlessness that few expected, the defence of Australia became a frantic and fearful urgency. Brisbane, Townsville, and the whole of Queensland came to be seen as potential landing sites that were as crucial as they were vulnerable. For the most part of 1942, Frank McCosker was to take part in the feverish haste to prepare and guard the installations within Brisbane on Kings Ford Smith Drive, followed by an exodus to Townsville for the potential invasion that all Australians knew had to come. But as Frank McCosker sought to garnish his home state against attack, the need for forward defence saw Australian attention and planning move further north to the territory of New Guinea. It was here that Australia would take the first dramatic stance in the war, in the Pacific, an environment of mud, flies and swamp that would serve as the nation's first line of crucial defence. As the area of New Guinea around Port Moresby and Rabaul became the Allied military hub, the need for a northern location to act as an early warning and site of first contact was recognised. In finding a place to repel the Japanese military, Frank and the rest of the AIF found themselves preparing a base not yet even on their maps. But Milne Bay would not be a place forgotten. For months in mid-1942, the lives of these soldiers was backbreaking work, clearing jungle, enduring insufferable heat, and risking crippling bouts of malaria. This tension only tempered by the ever-present fear of a surprise Japanese attack. The fears of these Australian defenders would have been further agitated by the news that the Japanese units on course for Milne Bay were cracked and seasoned veterans from Nanking and Singapore. There was little margin for error in preparing the Allied defence amid a remote wilderness. Under the astute care of Frank McCosker and his comrades, this tiny unknown spot was to become a strongly armed and guarded redoubt. The onslaught of the rising sun was to strike the fragile base at Milne Bay, was to occur not once but twice, of August 1942, but this time the attackers were to realise that beneath the seemingly thin layer of Australia's defence was to be found layers of bonded steel. The first attack was to come August 25th, as the Japanese at last came to be seen the landing base at Milne Bay as a potential threat to their developing invasion force. However, the confident Japanese fleet were unaware of the skill and cunning of the Allied codebreakers, who gave the militia advance notice of the Japanese plans to attack. The lightning surprise attacks that had served the Japanese fleet so well so far in the Pacific would this time be undone, as the poorly manned installation they hoped to find at Milne Bay turned out to be an alert and well-equipped force comprised of 2 full Australian brigades alongside Allied troops, thousands of men like Frank McCosker ready and willing to face the enemy. From the first wave of attack, Japanese barges found themselves outwitted and outgunned, facing fixed machine guns, determined soldiers, and precise aerial bombing by the RAAF. In an act of foresight, the Australians had seeded the bay with 44-gallon drums of petrol that exploded and turned the planned Japanese line of entry into a burning inferno. The second attack on August 29th was to be a much greater confrontation and would accord the Australian soldiers their own baptism of fire. As Frank McCosker and his mates were preparing for the long-awaited relief, after 45 days, the Japanese struck again, but in greater force. With the larger fleet and weaponry they now commanded, Japan must have expected a different outcome, but once again, hopes of overwhelming an exhausted foe were dashed, as the forces of Japan found themselves taking on a resolved and battle-hardened force that fought with everything, from bayonets to sticky bombs, to hold their advantage. The Battle of Milne Bay was to rage until September 7th, in the air, on the sea, and on the shore of the new but vital Allied foothold. Frank McCosker was one of the thousands who dug in and fought amid fire, fury, and explosions, never surrendering an inch and never asking or giving a quarter. No matter the artillery, surprise, or advance, the beleaguered Japanese would not concede, and as the Australians went on the offense on August, the initial skirmish had become the first major battle in the defence of Australia in the Pacific War. By the start of September, the battle was over. Milne Bay and New Guinea were secured, and both sides could predict that the capture of the island was destined to not be an easy conquest, but a long and bitter confrontation, where every inch of ground won in the next 3 years would only come through blood and sacrifice. For Frank McCosker and the thousands who fought with him, Milne Bay would only be the beginning of the fight, but thanks to their endurance, courage, and resolve, it would be a fight where Australia would not be found wanting or unprepared. Like Milne Bay, Australia was shown not to be a marooned outpost, but a fiercely armed and prepared war machine that would not shrink, not quake, and not back down. The eventual victory of Australia and her allies in the Pacific, and the safety and freedom that brought generations to follow, was due to the courage and tenacity of men like Frank McCosker, who left us on September 8, 2020. The safety of Australia guaranteed at Milne Bay by men like Frank, that was his gift to us, and the duty to remember and honour what he and others did is our gift to them. Thank you.